Hello, my name is Russ Barkley, and I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry, currently at the Virginia Treatment Center for Children and Virginia Commonwealth University Medical Center here in Richmond, Virginia. It's an honor for me to be invited by ABCT to create this short video on my own career, as well as any observations I might have about the field of behavioral and cognitive therapy, specifically, or clinical psychology more generally. And I thank them for that invitation. So the first question that's been posed to me is, how did I come to be interested in the field of psychology? It's a bit of a long story, and I'll try to condense it very briefly for the sake of time here. But I was in high school in Clinton, Maryland, and in my senior year, a psychology teacher came to the school to begin teaching the first courses in psychology that were being offered at the high school. Her name was Mrs. Cunningham, and she was delightful. And so I was in her classes, and at that time we all decided to start a psychology interest club that met weekly after high school. And a number of us who were interested in that did so. And I became elected president, probably because I missed a meeting somewhere. And so my interest probably dates back to then, and I've always thanked Mrs. Cunningham for encouraging me to remain interested in psychology. Shortly thereafter, however, I did enlist in the military and did serve 4 years in the Air Force, as well as a year in Vietnam with the Marines. And it was after I returned from the war and was stationed in North Carolina that I began to resume my college education, and especially the general basic undergraduate work. Once I was discharged from the military, I went over to the University of North Carolina, where I developed a strong interest in biology and evolution, and was studying that along with some courses in psychology, particularly its biological aspects. But I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and so I knew I had to do something besides get good grades. So I began to offer to volunteer as a research assistant without pay for any researchers who might need some extra assistance. I wandered around the medical school at that time, because I was very much interested in clinical work as well. And I happened to be directed to a fellow who had just received a NIH grant to study hyperactive children and the effects of medication on them. And that was Dr. Donald Ruth. And he did need some assistance, and so I became one of his research assistants. And after a few months, he convinced me to become his honor student. And I did so, and never regretted it. So I spent 2 years there, nearly 2 years, working with Don and his colleagues at the medical school in the Child Development Center while taking classes in the psychology department. And that fostered my love not only of psychology and clinical work, but specifically that is where my interest in ADHD began. I also had a keen interest in behavioral interventions for childhood disorders and behavioral theory more generally, because of the faculty there who were also teaching and doing clinical services. And here I want to thank Carolyn and Steve Schroeder, who were also working in the same department at the Child Development Center and were strongly influenced by behavioral theory and the interventions developed therefrom. So I had a number of good mentors who were focused on problems of children, but also on behavioral means of addressing those problems. And I've never regretted nor forgotten those early influences on my choice to become a psychologist. So from there, I went on to graduate school at Bowling Green State University to work with one of Don's own graduate students, and that was, of course, Douglas Ullman, who unfortunately passed away very early in his career. And from there, went out to another behavioral stronghold at the Oregon Health Sciences Center in Portland, Oregon, to work myself and train in the Child Development Center there that was affiliated with that medical center, which of course also had a number of faculty who were engaged not only in studying clinical disorders of children, particularly developmental disabilities, but also who were using a number of behavioral interventions with these children and following the development of behavioral and cognitive theories to assist with developing even more interventions. So all along the way, from high school through undergraduate work and my graduate schooling and then internship, I have been exposed to some very brilliant and fine psychologists in the areas of developmental disabilities, child clinical work, behavioral interventions, and also in child neuropsychology, which is my other specialty interest. Just as an aside, I became interested in clinical neuropsychology because, of course, I came into psychology out of biology, and I still had a very deep interest in questions of biological evolution, species development, especially behavioral ethology and how species behave in the environment. So it was just a natural combination of my interests in biology that as I moved into psychology, I retained that and focused primarily on clinical neuropsychology, and especially with children with developmental disorders during my graduate and subsequent career. And so when I left Oregon, I went to the Milwaukee Children's Hospital for my first job, which was in a neurology department, child neurology specifically, and I was the first psychologist to work within the department and was given an opportunity to develop a neuropsychology service at first for children and then for adults during my 8 years there before moving on to the University of Massachusetts Medical Center and becoming the director of psychology there. But throughout, the threads of neuropsychology, behaviorism, cognitive behavioral therapies, and an interest in developmental disabilities, specifically ADHD, has always been sort of the common weave of these threads into my career. So how did I get interested in behavioral and cognitive interventions more specifically? Well, as I said, I was influenced by some very fine behaviorally trained psychologists. Also, being someone who came into psychology with a strong love of science, I was not very enamored of the other treatment approaches and theories in psychology and psychiatry, such as psychoanalysis or related theories of psychopathology, believing them to be fairly unscientific, vague, and just very difficult to evaluate from an empirical basis. And so behaviorism appealed to me because of its focus on the scientific method, critical thinking, the development of hypotheses and testing them, and then designing and developing interventions that could also be tested for their effectiveness out of these theories. So it was a natural fit for me to move further and further into behaviorism and then eventually into cognitive and behavioral therapies in my work, given their very strong evidence base to them and the sort of scientific philosophical basis of behaviorism more generally. And so it was my work at University of North Carolina with some fine behavioral people, and then on to Bowling Green there as well with a number of very excellent behavior therapists, and then on to the Oregon Health Sciences University. And there virtually all the faculty that we trained with used a behavioral approach for the most part in dealing with childhood disorders. Specifically, I became a student of Constance Hanff. Connie was a psychologist who really didn't publish much, if any, work, but who was one of the first people to develop behavioral parent training programs for developmentally disabled children. And while Jerry Patterson, who was working just down the road in Eugene, Oregon, was doing much the same, Connie independently had gone on to use behavioral therapy to create a behavioral parent training program. And there's a fine article by Robert McMahon and others on this unseen but strongly felt influence of Connie on the subsequent development of many behavioral parent training programs that are now sort of standard in the field. They all, in one way or another, owe their allegiance to Connie in large part, and of course to some extent to Jerry Patterson's fine work at the Oregon Research Institute as well. So Connie's program was using behavioral and contingency management approaches for developmentally disabled children, and Rex Forehand trained there, and Eric Mash, and myself, and Charles Cunningham, but also those people went on to train other people such as Robert McMahon. And then, of course, we had the influence of Sheila Iberg was there when Connie was there, and then Carolyn Webster Stratton also trained there with Sheila, and to some extent may have had contact with Connie as well. And you can kind of see this sort of incestuous growing influence of Connie's work on her direct trainees, such as myself and Rex and Charles and others, but also indirectly through their own students as they left Oregon and began to further study and publish articles on Connie's two-stage program for training families to manage disruptive behavior. I, of course, took the program to Milwaukee and then began to apply it to ADHD children as well as children with other neurological problems, and began to incorporate into that program other developments out of other behavioral research to expand the program from what essentially was a two-stage program to a 10-step program for training families with oppositional behavior. Rex, of course, went on to the University of Georgia, where he continued to study Connie's program primarily in its original form, and you can read his treatment program in his books on the non-compliant child. Out of there, of course, came the Incredible Years program by Carolyn Webster Stratton, Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, which is Sheila Iberg's version of the very same program, Charles Cunningham's COAT program for Community Opportunities in Parent Education, which he developed in Hamilton, Canada, and Ontario when he moved to McMaster University Medical Center after leaving Oregon, and others as well, so far too many to name. But so my interest in behavioral interventions was encouraged by Connie and the faculty in Oregon, and then led me to study her own program and develop my own treatment manuals, which are Defiant Children and Defiant Teens, to further elaborate, amend, and otherwise research the program that Connie originally developed, and then to disseminate it more widely in psychology. And that's where those manuals came from as well. So I've also been asked to comment on what I think were my major contributions to date to psychology. That's very difficult after one's been working in this field for some 46 years now, I guess, since my undergraduate honors thesis on hyperactive children and the influence of reinforcement contingencies on their symptoms. But I would have to say, besides studying the effects of medication on social interactions within families, specifically my first overall focus, and where I think I might have had some initial impact on the field, was looking at both medication and behavioral interventions for their effects on mother-child and then later father-child interactions within the families of ADHD children. And here I like to credit Charles Cunningham for his work with me when we were both at Oregon during our training years. It was his interest in mother-child interactions and language-delayed children, and my interest in ADHD and behavioral work and medications, and it was just a natural blend for us to combine our interests into this very innovative treatment approach, or innovative research program on studying mother-child interactions and then testing for the effects of medication and placebos on what would happen in these interactions if we treated the children with these agents. And then, of course, we also went on to study behavioral interventions for these children as well. And while I was there, I designed one of the first classrooms for ADHD children, along with Ann Copeland and others, where we had children come to our clinic for their afternoon and spend several hours a day with us while we implemented a variety of behavioral interventions in that classroom, and then subsequently published that research. So probably my work on family interaction patterns and the effects of interventions on them was my first contribution. But of course, I maintained my own clinical interests in neuropsychology and continued to follow research and theory in that area, and began to see how the development of the prefrontal lobes, and specifically the executive functions that are mediated by them, had a direct bearing on understanding ADHD and its symptoms. And I began to think of ADHD as a developmental disability of executive functioning back when I was in Milwaukee and later at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And there reached a point where I felt that the evidence in both fields was becoming sufficiently compelling to begin to develop a theory of executive functioning generally, one that is more operational, I think, than most, and then to apply that theory to a further understanding of ADHD and its own symptoms and deficits. And so, of course, I began publishing articles in Psychological Bulletin, and then a full book on this executive functioning theory, on ADHD and the nature of self-control. And then from there, another book later on the executive functions and why they evolved and what they mean for people like those with ADHD, and so on. So I've continued to build on that work over the last 20 years or more. So I'd have to say my work in executive functioning and neuropsychology of ADHD, probably my second pathway in my career that I think may have been influential on the field. And then in Milwaukee, I was doing my studies on mother-child interactions, and I kept following these children over time in my clinical work who had been in our research study. And eventually, Mary Ellen Fisher, a colleague of mine who had trained with Tom Achenbach, Mary Ellen came to work with me, and she and I began to write up research grants to do follow-up studies of these children into adolescence. And it was the funding of those follow-up studies that got me interested and continued my interest over many years in looking at the outcomes of ADHD children in adolescence and later in adulthood. And that, of course, is our long-running Milwaukee longitudinal study and the many, many publications that Mary Ellen and I had out of that long-term research. Of course, there were other people doing longitudinal studies as well. And so, credit goes, of course, to Sal Manuzza and Rochelle Klein in New York, who had the New York longitudinal study. Of course, the seminal psychiatrists in Canada, Montreal, would be Gabrielle Weiss and her colleague Lily Heckman had their own studies going on at the same time. Of course, Jan Loney, and later with Richard Milich at the University of Iowa. And then, of course, some work was being done out in California by Carol Whalen and Steve Hinshaw and others that influenced our longitudinal work. So lots of things going on at the time. But our work concentrated not just on the psychiatric and educational outcomes, but we also began looking at driving, at money management, also at occupational functioning, and at the health outcomes of these individuals besides the traditional psychiatric outcomes that others were studying. And so lately we, I think, have been among some of the first people to report on the impact of ADHD adversely on mortality rates and especially life expectancy calculations when these children reach adulthood. So basically we're showing that ADHD is a public health disorder and not just a mental health disorder. So probably my longitudinal studies may have had some influence on the thinking of others and our understanding of ADHD as well. Most recently, for the past decade, I have been strongly interested in the sluggish cognitive tempo, which is a second attention disorder that we began to identify in the field back in the 1980s, thanks to the work of Ben Leahy, Karen Carlson, Nieper, and others who were working with Ben at the time, and with Karen, and kept identifying symptoms that were not very good at identifying people with ADHD, but seemed to form a separate dimension of attention deficits from those of ADHD. Not much interest occurred over the next decade or so, but by 2000, 2001, Richard Milich and a number of others, and myself included, kept finding this set of symptoms to be helpful in explaining some of the children coming to our practice, particularly those being called ADD without hyperactivity, more recently ADHD inattentive type or presentation now. These children were unlike the combined type of ADHD in that they did not have significant hyperactivity, had no whiff, so to speak, of disinhibition or impulsivity, yet continued to manifest very strong deficits in attention and concentration, though of a very different sort from ADHD. These children engaged in a lot of staring, daydreaming, mind wandering, if you will. Also were sort of cognitively easily confused, didn't seem to process information very quickly or accurately, were very slow moving, if not hypoactive, lethargic, passive, and to some extent withdrawn. And so I've been doing work over the past decade on trying to clarify the nature of that disorder, developing rating scales, encouraging others, such as Steve Becker and others, to take this on as a career. Steve, of course, is doing some excellent work in the field of SCT, along with Len Burns, Keith McBurnett, Linda Pfeiffer, and some others. So this is a growing area, and I think we have identified for sure a second attention condition. Whether it rises to the level of a full disorder, it remains arguable. I think that it does, but others probably don't yet. But it's a growing area of fertile research in the field of clinical child psychology and neuropsychology. So there you have it. I think those are the major contributions that I think I may have made to the field. It's for others to decide that, of course. And I hope you found this venture into my own career path and my own career influences to be of some interest to you. Thank you.